Okay, so I'm going to talk about my reflections on Ferenc Martin's book, Necessary Conditions of Learning. The outline is as follows. First, we'll introduce the book and the author, and then cover the main points of the book, phenomenography, variation theory, and learning theory. And finally, we'll end with a overview of the disposition of the book, of the various chapters. So let's get started with the book and the author. So the book is Necessary Conditions of Learning by Ferenc Martin. It was published in 2015. So what can we say about this book? Well, so far it has been cited 668 times according to Google Scholar, which is quite a few citations. And basically, the book is the life work of Ferenc Martin, or it's a summary or overview of his research throughout his life. And what can we say about Ferenc Martin, the author? Well, if we use KTH favorite indicator of importance, we'll go to the citation counts in Google Scholar. So you see he's quite heavily cited, receiving roughly between 3,000 and 4,000 citations per year the last few years, which is quite considerable. So he's an important figure and has done important work in pedagogy throughout his career. So it's definitely an interesting book. So let's start with a quote that summarizes quite well what the book is about and how it relates to other learning theories. So the particular theory in this book is not about the general aspects, but about the specific aspects, that is, those related to the content of learning. Most other theories of learning are about the general aspects. This one is not, except when the learning is learning to learn. So this summarizes well what the book is about and how it relates to the other theories, and particularly what I like about this book, because this book is quite detailed on the specific content and what content must look like or be like to be able to learn anything from it. And none of the other learning theories says anything about that. So it's very interesting in that sense. So the main ideas that he's communicating in this book is first phenomenography, and then variation theory and learning studies. And these relate to each other. And we'll get to the details now. So let's start with phenomenography. So we'll introduce phenomenography by another quote from the book. We tacitly assume that what we see is exactly what is there to be seen, and that others see things in the same way we do. It is hard to realize that we have actually learned to see the world in certain ways, and that others may have learned to see it differently. And this captures quite well the idea of phenomenography, and the perspective on learning and the world in this book, that you see the world not as it is, but through some kind of filter, and that is phenomenography. So to state it differently, reality is experienced by each individual, and people interpret significant aspects of reality. So with an emphasis on interpret. So it doesn't necessarily look the same to each person. And this is what the book is about. It's about the way we view learning is to learn something is to change one's views of the world. So to change the view. And when it comes to phenomenography, we talk about a first order and second order perspective. And the first order perspective, that's what actually describes various aspects of the world. So that's how we see it, how each individual sees it. And the second order perspective, that describes people's experience of various aspects of the world. So that is phenomenography, trying to describe and capture how various individuals express their experience of the world. So trying to get their perspective. And we can get this in several ways. Like when we do teaching in programming, for instance, and the students have not fully grasped something, so they've done some mistake. We usually call that a misconception, but that's their view of programming and how this functions. Whereas we can see that it differs from our perspective in that they have encountered a mistake and it doesn't work, and they've misunderstood something. So that's the idea of phenomenography, and trying to capture how the student trying to describe this misconception, for instance, would be something we can do with phenomenography. So trying to describe the student's view of the world. The next main idea in the book is variation theory. And it's based on the ideas of phenomenography that different people view the world and experience the world. Particularly experience the world is a very good expression, and it's reused throughout the book. And variation theory, it says the following. So learning depends on the person discerning certain features or aspects of the world. And to be able to discern something, we need variation. So from variation comes discernment, and from discernment comes learning. And the core idea is that there must be a pattern of variation to experience. So that's the necessary condition, that there must be this pattern. And for learning to take place, the learner must experience this pattern, because even if the pattern is there, the person doesn't necessarily experience it. Maybe he or she was distracted at that particular moment that this particular detail was mentioned in the lecture, for instance. Or maybe they just skimmed and didn't pay attention to that particular detail. It didn't look significant. So that's the idea. So what are these variations? What do we mean by that? What does it look like? And yeah, these patterns, there are three patterns of variation. The first one is contrast, and that is simply highlighting the differences between two things that are otherwise very similar. They should be identical, except in the aspect that we intend. And in this case, we have several aspects present here. We have shape and we have color. And we can see that these two figures only differ in one aspect, its color, because the shape is invariant in this case. So that's the first pattern. And after that one, we move on to generalization. which is keeping the focused aspect, so color in this case, invariant, so both are blue in this case, but we change the shape showing that several things can be blue. So that's the idea. And finally, we have the fusion pattern, which is the last step to take, where we show that several things can have different colors. So it's not that the circle always have to be blue, or that the square always have to be blue. They can be different colors. And the patterns must be experienced in this order for learning to take place. So if you haven't had contrast, you can't make sense of the generalization. So that's the idea of the theory, and it covers quite extensively empirical studies showing that this is indeed the case. So the problem with teaching nowadays, I mean, in basically all teaching, is that we tend to focus on induction, and that's basically generalization without contrast before it. So we have several examples, like in the thesis courses. There are usually good theses from previous years, which serve as good examples. However, this is just induction, because if you haven't seen what a bad thesis is, then seeing just a few good theses won't tell you anything. So it won't tell you what is actually good and bad. You can't get much out of that. So the only thing you can do in that case is to imitate. So you can't get the essence out. You can just imitate these few cases, and you might get it wrong. Another example is showing what a linear, if we want to teach what a linear function is, that we just show a bunch of examples of linear functions, which doesn't capture what linearity is, because it doesn't show us any difference. So he has a nice example in the book about stating that you can't see the greenness of a cucumber in an entirely green world, because you can't see the difference between green and green. It's all green, so you can't get an idea of what green actually is. You need to have another color to compare with to actually appreciate the aspect of color, and particularly the features green and blue, for instance, that we had. So that's the idea of variation theory. The last point, the last main idea that he wants to communicate in the book that I like is learning study. And learning studies are basically design-based research combined with variation theory. And it extends the Japanese concept of lesson study that is used in schools in Japan. And the idea is that you first design the teaching material or plan the teaching using variation theory. So you analyze your course material using variation theory, because that can actually tell you if anything can be learned from your material. And then you perform the teaching. And after that, you analyze the teaching performance. So you watch a recording of the teaching, or you analyze some interactions during the teaching. And then you look at the student outcomes afterwards. So you test the students if they have learned what they were supposed to learn. And then you go back to the redesign the teaching material to improve it. And the specific thing about learning studies is that you work in teacher teams, so several teachers that teach the same thing but have several classes, because then this yields iterations. So the teachers plan the lesson, the material, whatever, they design it together, and then one teacher performs it, then they analyze the outcome, and then they redesign it. Then the next teacher teaches it, they analyze the outcome, redesign, and then the last teacher performs the teaching. So then they can have several iterations in short time. So for instance, if the first class has treats this particular topic on Monday, then the second class can treat it on Wednesday and the last one on Friday. Then they have these iterations in short interval. So that's the idea of lesson learning studies. And this can be on modules, so not just one lesson. And my idea is to adapt this and systematically work according to this with my TAs in the reviewing and developing my programming course. So review the main material, the labs, so do a learning study on each weekly module in the course. And for instance, I can have 2 TAs who teach non-parallel tutorial groups. So as long as the tutorials are separate, like one on Thursday and one on Friday, then they can work together and we get one iteration there. It's harder for the lectures to do in one course, since the lectures are just given once. So let's move on to the disposition of the book. So the book has 7 chapters, and the first 4 cover the main theory. So this covers the theoretical foundations. It has studies on how that support this theory, and the beautiful thing about these chapters is that he presents his own studies that supports this, but he also goes to other people's studies and explain their results using this theory. So for instance, he revisits Vygotsky's studies and explains some of them, why he got these results and why they indicate the same thing. He also went to Piaget and Montessori and explained why the core principles are aligned with this theory. So why it works. It's really nice. The second half of the book, basically these 3 chapters are almost half of the book. They essentially treat theory in practice. So we can go into the details of each chapter now. So the first chapter, what makes humans human, look at different forms of learning and what learning and particularly what pedagogy actually is and how that should be defined. So what is pedagogy? And essentially the conclusion is pedagogy is what separates humans from other animals, because we try to systematically teach our offspring according to what pedagogy actually is. So it's a very nice chapter. The second chapter is about learning objectives, and this treats several aspects of learning objectives and really goes in depth to what is actually a learning objective, and several levels of learning objectives that are important for the rest of the book. So we have the learning objectives that are in the syllabus, but that's at a too high level. So you need to break it up and look further into the details to actually see what is actually required to learn to master something or to master a particular learning object on the syllabus level. Then we have chapter 3, which basically covers variation theory. So sameness and difference in learning. So what is variation theory and what are the ideas? Then chapter 4, what does the world look like to others, is phenomenography, and how can we try to get what other people experience, what are their views of the world. So this one also gets into assessment of sorts, because essentially what you want to do when you do assessment is to see if the students have the right view of the world, if they have developed the view of the world that they were supposed to do during the course, for instance. Then we get into these practical parts, so the theory and practice, as I called it. So the art of learning, this treats how people learn on their own. So basically, when the students are sitting studying for the exam, this is what they do. And this chapter revisits other works of Marton. For instance, it was Marton and Selye who coined the terms deep and surface learning back in '76. So this actually revisits surface and deep learning, and actually Marton concludes that deep learning is actually, if a person employs deep learning, they are actually performing these patterns of variation that I talked about. So they first do the contrast and the generalization and then the fusion. That is what is deep learning, actually. That's what he concludes in one of the studies that he covers in this chapter. Very interesting. And the next chapter is making learning possible. So about teaching, essentially. So how can teachers use this theory to improve their teaching? So this is what this chapter is about. And the final chapter, learning to help others to learn, that one is about learning studies. So essentially education research. So how can you do this systematically to learn what actually works, so you can help disseminate that this is a good way of teaching this material. And that was everything I wanted to cover in this video. Thanks a lot.